Thank you, Chair. I have a few questions, which are probably practical questions to both the witnesses, please. First of all, I'll go through them and all together, if that's okay. First of all, I'd just be very interested to know whether the vaccine is planned to work on people who've already had COVID. Obviously, we've got a large number of the population who will have had COVID during the past 8 or 9 months. Will it be used for them?
So the first question related to whether these vaccines would be used for those that had already had COVID-19, and I think the answer there is yes, there is evidence that they would boost potentially those that may have a variety of levels of immune response to COVID-19. That's already incorporated in our current trials, and I suspect in the Oxford trials.
Thank you. Professor Pollard, same questions.
Thanks. So I guess the first question was about people who previously had COVID, those who are positive already at baseline. And one of the requirements for regulators around the world is that that group of people is included in the clinical trials. And the reason for that is when we get to the point of rollout, we know that there will be some people in the population who don't know they've had the disease. And so we need to know, first of all, the point that Robin made, whether or not they boost, but also whether there are any safety concerns of people who've been previously infected getting the vaccines. So in our trials, we have included seropositive people who have previously had infection. So we will be able to answer that question.
Used for them. The second question relates to the previous questions around the order of rollout, but also related to a comment that's been made around what the vaccines will actually do in terms of could they prevent transmission and so on. Do you see there being a chance that there would be multiple vaccines, so one perhaps reducing transmission, another preventing somebody from getting the symptoms? Do you see a position where we might get to a point where we have an annual vaccine, or do you see this as a one-off?
The question about transmission versus infection is really one that we won't know till we get the data. Do I think there may be a requirement?
On that point, though, do you see a point where if one vaccine could work for transmission and a different trial from another country perhaps works on another level, could you ever see a case where there could be two vaccines that people have to take?
So I think it's more likely that we'll see different waves of introduction of vaccines. So it's unlikely that a vaccine that blocks transmission won't also prevent severe disease. But it's certainly possible that the first vaccines may reach the bar of preventing severe disease, but may not necessarily block transmission. And so we may see those introduced first, because they'll be first past the post. But as we see later vaccines that may be more potent, we may see that they're replaced. And so it's quite likely that we will have a number of vaccines introduced. They will need to be monitored carefully because we won't know how long they'll provide immunity for. And so we certainly need to have a strategy for reboosting, most likely reboosting of vulnerable populations where immunity may potentially wane faster. And so those considerations need to be taken into account. The approach that we're developing is particularly suitable for reboosting campaigns because you get no immunity against the vaccine itself, which is something that occurs with some of the viral vector-delivered vaccines.
The second question was about whether we'll have different types of vaccines which do different things. First of all, we don't have the data, so I don't know that yet, and that's something which we'll have to find out in time. The second thing that really answers that question is when you look at the different trials that are going on around the world, I'm not sure that all of them will actually address the question you're asking. So we may have quite good clarity about whether the vaccines prevent symptomatic disease, because that's the primary endpoint, primary analysis that's undertaken in all of the trials. But the transmission question is actually a much harder one to get to. One way you could do it is look in the households of those people who are vaccinated and see if there are less people in that household who get disease. The other would be to actually look at individuals to see whether they get infected if they've been vaccinated, even if they have no symptoms. And that's what we're doing in our trials in the UK. And I think, you know, a pretty amazing effort with government and with the NHS. We're taking swabs from 10,000 people in the trials every week during the course of follow-up to find out whether people have asymptomatic infection. If those who are vaccinated don't get asymptomatic infection, that makes it very likely that the vaccine could be transmission blocking. So that's something which we will know in time, but it's going to take a while to dig into the results. But I think one word of caution is I'm not sure we'll have the transmission question from all of the trials that are going on around the world. You also asked a question about whether we need annual vaccines. And of course, we don't know the answer to that. The main reason you would need an annual vaccine, one is that the immunity you get from the first 2 doses that you have doesn't last, and you become susceptible to reinfection. I think that is possible. The only situation we have to fall back on, which is the coronaviruses that all of us normally get as children, this is a family of viruses which is actually very common, and we all get those viruses as children. Unfortunately, we don't get perfect immunity when we get those infections as children, and through our adult life, every few years we'll get a cold caused by coronavirus. Now, we don't get severely ill with it, we get a mild infection, but it does tell you something about the immunity from natural infection over time not being complete. It doesn't give you complete protection. We don't know whether vaccines are going to be like that or whether they'll give complete protection that lasts for years. And the only way we'll know the answer to that is actually by some time passing. You know, the first vaccines are only 6 months in, so we can't tell whether we're still protected a year from now. And of course, we don't even know whether the vaccines are protective yet in the first 6 months. The other reason why we might have a need for annual vaccination would be like influenza, where the virus changes each year. Perhaps if you have lots of people vaccinated, the virus, in order to survive, will have to mutate so that the vaccine is no longer able to protect against it. And that's what influenza does to some extent. And so that would be another reason why we might need to have a revised vaccine in future years. At the moment, we just don't know the answer to that question either. We've not seen changes in the virus that so far that seem likely to have that impact. But there are lots of people who are immune in populations at the moment to try and drive the virus to do that.
And then I'd also be very keen to understand on the trials. I know one of the big issues that's been reported is around the impact on the BAME community. I was interested to know how that's going in terms of trials, whether it has more or less of an impact and how that's working.
Thank you.
You also asked about BAME effects, and certainly we're looking at that in our trials. We would still like to encourage more people from those groups to come forward for clinical testing because it's really an important consideration. But so far we haven't seen any evidence of either increased side effects or less potent immune responses in those.
You then asked about the BAME population included in the trials that we're undertaking here in the UK. That will be part of the analyses that we do later on. I think one of the really important strategies that we have in our vaccine development programme was to ensure that we were inclusive from a UK population, but also that there was generalisability around the world. And so our trials are set up so that we have 10,000 people vaccinated in Latin America, 2,000 in Africa, and we also, through our partnerships, have people being vaccinated in Asia as well. So we have a large database of information that is being gathered from different ethnic and geographic settings around the world, as well as trying to address those issues here in the UK.
Thank you.
And then very finally, a very practical question. Am I correct in assuming any vaccine that comes out would be an injection, or would it be delivered through a different approach from the work that's been done so far, please?
Thank you very much indeed.
And lastly, you asked about whether it's all injection, and the answer is that almost all of the vaccines being developed are looking only at injections. It is possible that there could be some vaccines later on which use a different route of immunisation, like the nasal flu vaccine that's used at the moment, but none of those are at an advanced stage of development. And so I think we can't really answer that, whether that's possible, certainly not in the near future.
Okay, Dean Russell, and then Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Chair. My questions were also going to be around rollout, but I do have one big question connected to that, which hopefully you can help. One of the conversations I've heard recently are around concerns around taking the vaccine. I don't mean extremes of anti-vaxxers, which obviously is a very dangerous movement, but actually around just the general public, where they've said, look, you know, this has gone through very quickly, you know, I've got to inject something into myself that we're unsure of. Could you just give me some reassurance on two parts? One is that it will be safe. And secondly, have there been discussions at this point around a really sophisticated and strong communication strategy to reassure the public that, you know, should they start to be able to take a vaccine, that it will be okay for them?
Great questions. So the reassurance of will it be safe, and Andy talked a little bit about this earlier, the safety testing and the safety standards that are being imposed on these vaccine trials are no different from any new therapeutic or new vaccines that are being developed. So there's been no diminution of standards or shortcuts or anything. So from a perspective of are we using the gold-plated world-class standards for safety monitoring? Yes, we are. We also benefit in the UK for because everybody has an NHS number, so we can actually do real-time pharmacovigilance, which is how are those people who've received the vaccine performing, so that we can monitor to see the long-term safety of these studies. As an aside, I've joined a vaccine study so that if I thought there was concerns about safety, I wouldn't have done so, and I have done so, and I can be quite clear that the treatment that I've been getting and the care with safety is absolutely paramount. So that goes back to, that's your first question. The second bit about the comms is there's two aspects. From the vaccine task force perspective, yes, we have a broad strategy for public education just to tell people about how the vaccines work, what progress we've made, what are the strategies we're using to tackle some of the issues, because our goal is to establish the UK as a global leader in vaccine R&D and to encourage international communication. And ultimately, this will be great industry for the UK economy. So our strategy to communicate and collaborate means that I've talked to all sorts of groups, whether it's women's groups, civil society groups like Global Justice Now, industry, clinical, manufacturing groups, as well as international groups like the World Bank and Gates. I've given more than 100 interviews. I've written in Nature, I've written in Lancet. We've now got 9 podcasts, of which on Spotify and Amazon, where we specifically tackle some of these issues about safety, how do we get different communities into clinical trials, how are we manufacturing it, what is the role that the UK is playing in the international community. So we're doing a sort of a narrow communications activity from the Vaccine Task Force, but of course the broader vaccine communications, again, will be led by Department of Health as part of their broader vaccination and deployment campaigns and communications, and that will address the vaccine hesitance, because a lot of the vaccine hesitance is not to dismiss people's concerns, because they're right to be concerned, and it's a complicated, fast-moving field, and we need to address the concerns and allow people to have their conversations with their doctors or their civic leaders or whoever is trusted that can actually give them advice and the discussions that would be helpful. So I think we need to be open to it.
Thank you. And if I may, just a couple of related questions. One is on the combination. I'm pretty confident I asked a question a few months ago in one of our Health and Social Care Select Committees, where I'd heard there was tests of a combined vaccine with flu, and I heard a comment earlier which seemed to indicate that that's not the case. So I'd just be keen to know whether there is any movement on a combined vaccine. And secondly, related to the combination side of things, how have the tests been done with regards, people who are taking other types of drugs? Because we don't all live in a COVID-only world. There's lots of other things that people will be taking. I'd just be keen to get reassurance on that. And then very finally, you mentioned about tracking symptoms once the vaccine's out there. I'm conscious that the NHS track and trace app has performed very well. It had, I think, the fastest download of any app ever, I believe, on the App Store. Has there been any discussions around using an app to enable people who've had a vaccine to track their side effects, if there are any, or their symptoms as they immediately after they take it? Because I know with the flu vaccine, many people report that they don't feel too great for a few days after. So if you could cover those points, I'd really appreciate it.
Okay.
Kate Bingham.
Yes, a lot of questions there. So the first one is there are clinical studies, small arms of studies are being run co-administered with flu, but the bulk of the main phase 3 studies are not currently being run with flu. So the initial label is not expected to allow for co-administration with flu, albeit those are under investigation now. Ultimately, from a vaccine task force perspective, I would like to see a single shot, ideally a pill, or something that doesn't involve a needle, which could combine a flu and a COVID antigen and then stimulate immunity twice. But at the moment, in the likely initial label that the regulators are likely to give will not allow for co-administration with flu. By this time next year, I'm sure the answer will be it will be, but it's not yet. That's your first question. Co-administration with other drugs, yes, because the point of the trials is to include as diverse a group of people in the clinical trials so that we can be sure that the vaccines can work in all people who are most vulnerable. So in fact, we do and have pushed very hard to enrich for Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities in our vaccine trials because they are at specific risk from COVID infection. We are also enriching for elderly and those people with underlying serious diseases. All of those, especially the people with underlying serious diseases, will be taking medicines, and we want to be sure that these vaccines are safe in those groups and that the vaccines are effective. So yes, we will be, that is in hand. And again, we need to wait to see the data to see whether or not the vaccines actually work. But absolutely, that is being investigated. As far as tracking, that again really is a Department of Health issue because the MHRA is an agency within the Department of Health. And the different tools that they use is up to them as how to do it. And whether or not the track and trace then feeds into the electronic medical records, I don't know. But that ultimately is obviously what we want. We need to be able to get to a position using the latest AI tools that you can actually identify how the vaccines are performing in the wild, as we call it, to be sure that they are doing what we expect them to be doing.